All right, so today we're really diving deep into 12 rules for life, huh?
Yeah, it's a big one, right? Lots of people seem to have found it pretty, well, impactful
Yeah, we've definitely been getting a lot of requests for this one.
for good reason.
So we've gone through it all.
Yeah, I mean, like, really try to pull out, the core, like, what are the big, I don't know, I guess takeaways would be the word.
Yeah, the takeaways, the nuggets, like what do people really need to know about this?
Right, because it is, dense.
It is dense, not exactly light reading.
So we want to give you, like, the essence of it, right?
Make sure everyone listening really gets it.
Like, the main arguments, like, why should I even care? What's this guy even saying?
And then, okay, if I buy into this, like what does that even mean for me? How do I like live this?
Right, exactly. And I think it's important to remember, too, that, like, this isn't just about, like 5 easy steps to a better life.
Yeah, this is some deep stuff.
Yeah, this is getting at, like, pretty fundamental principles about, like, how to be a human being in the world.
Yeah, for sure. Like, what does it even mean to live a good life, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And it's pulling from, like, all sorts of different areas, right? Like psychology,
Yeah. Like
philosophy,
mythology even.
right? Like, trying to really understand the human condition,
Hmm.
you know?
So, yeah, big picture stuff. And our job is to try to, like, distill all that down.
Yeah, exactly. Make it clear, make it engaging, because it can get a little
Heady.
heady. Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah, we'll be your guides through these 12 rules.
Hopefully, without, getting too lost in the weeds.
Exactly. So before we jump in, let's give everyone a roadmap.
Okay, yeah, good idea. Like a preview.
Yeah, a preview. So just broadly speaking, what are some of the big overarching themes that we're going to be tackling here?
Well, I'd say, like, number one, like this idea of personal responsibility, that comes up again and again.
Yeah, like owning your life, right?
Exactly. And then this kind of, like, tension, right, between order and chaos.
Yeah, how we, like, navigate that, right?
Yeah, because it's always there, isn't it?
Yeah, constantly.
And then, this whole thing about social hierarchies.
Yeah, how those work, why they matter.
Right, because like it or not, they are a thing. And this book, like, really digs into that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the power of, like, self-awareness, but also, like, comparison.
Yeah, like comparing yourself, but in a healthy way.
Right, because it can go wrong, obviously.
Yeah.
But it can also be a really, useful tool for growth.
Yeah, like knowing where you stand, but also knowing who you are.
Exactly. And then lastly, I'd say this big theme of, like, sacrifice and, like, why it's important.
Yeah, what does that even mean, sacrifice, and why would we do it?
Right, like, is it just suffering or is there something more to it?
Okay, so lots to unpack there.
Definitely.
So should we just dive right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back.
I love this. It's such a simple thing, but
It's like so basic, right?
yeah, like something your mom would tell you.
Exactly. But the book is arguing that there's like a much deeper meaning here than just like, good posture.
Totally. It gets into, like, all this fascinating stuff about, like, dominance hierarchies.
Oh, yeah, like pecking order.
And not just in humans, right? Like, he talks about lobsters.
Lobsters. What do lobsters have to do with this?
Well, it turns out, like, where a lobster sits in that hierarchy literally affects its brain chemistry.
Seriously?
Yeah. Like, the lower ranking lobsters, they have less serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good.
Oh, interesting. So like,
So they're more, stressed, submissive.
so they're like the sad lobsters.
Kind of, yeah. And then he brings it back to humans, and he's like, look, same thing.
Oh, wow.
Low serotonin in humans, less confidence, more anxiety, potentially even shorter lifespan.
Whoa, hold on. So you're saying like my posture could actually affect how long I live?
Well, that's what he's suggesting, yeah. It's like our ancient brains, right? The part that's always assessing our social standing.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking cues from, like, how we present ourselves.
So if I'm slouching,
If you're slouching, your brain might be like, oh, low status.
and then bam, less serotonin.
And all the stuff that comes with that.
So it's not just about looking good. It's like a signal.
To yourself, yeah, and to others.
So for everyone listening, think about it. You see someone walking down the street, shoulders slumped,
Versus someone standing tall, chest out.
totally different vibe, right?
Right. And it might not just be a vibe. It might be, like, a real physiological difference.
Okay, so that's fascinating. And he also talks about like Price's law.
Yeah, which basically says, like, in a lot of fields, a small number of people do most of the work.
The 80-20 rule or whatever.
Yeah, kind of. And this is the Matthew principle, which is like, the rich get richer.
Oh, yeah, that one.
So his point is, like, hierarchies are everywhere.
You can't escape them.
Right. And so it's not about like denying that they exist or like being all, anti-hierarchy.
It's about understanding them.
Right. And maybe like understanding how you play into them, even in subtle ways.
Like with your posture.
Exactly. So I think a real life example here, like think about, two people going for a job interview.
Okay, yeah.
One slouching, one standing tall.
Who do you think's going to get the job?
Right. And it's not just about like appearances. It's like
Yeah.
that slouching person, they might literally be putting themselves at a disadvantage hormonally.
Wow. So stand up straight, folks. It's for your own good.
Yeah, for your health, your career, your whole life.
Okay, on to rule 2. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping.
Oh, this one's a good one. This one really gets at like our relationship with ourselves.
It's so true, though, isn't it? Like, we're often so much better at taking care of others
Than ourselves.
than ourselves. Like, I'll, bend over backwards for a friend, but when it comes to me, I'm like, whatever.
Right? Like, we're so much more forgiving of other people's mistakes.
Totally. And he even brings up, like, Adam and Eve, in the Bible.
Yeah, that feeling of shame, like right away.
Like, as soon as they, eat the apple, they're like, oh, my God, we messed up.
And they're trying to hide.
Hiding, yeah. And I think his point is, like, we all have that to some extent.
Inner critics.
Yeah, that voice that's like, you're not good enough, you messed up.
And it can be so loud.
Oh, yeah, it could be deafening.
And so he's saying, like, that's actually part of the problem.
That we're so aware of our own flaws?
Yeah, like we know all our own, shortcomings maybe better than anyone else does.
So we're harder on ourselves.
Exactly. So how do we, like, counteract that?
Well, he's saying, like, we have to recognize that we're worthy of care.
Inherently worthy. Yeah, like, regardless of our flaws.
Like, just by being human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that we have, like, a moral obligation, almost, to take care of ourselves.
It's like we would take care of someone we love.
Right. And this gets into, like, the whole idea of original sin, which, can be a loaded term.
Yeah, but he's not necessarily talking about it in a purely religious way.
Right. It's more like this recognition that, like, humans are capable of both good and bad.
We're complex.
We're messy. And so maybe, like, accepting that about ourselves can actually make us more compassionate.
More forgiving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, like, we're all in this together, right? We're all flawed.
So for everyone listening, like, have you ever been in that situation where, like, you're giving a friend amazing advice?
Coldly supportive.
And then you're going through something similar.
And you're so hard on yourself.
Brutal. Like, why do we do that?
I don't know. But we do. And I think this rule is, like, a call to stop doing that.
To be kinder to ourselves.
Yeah, and to recognize that, like, taking care of ourselves, it's not selfish. It's actually essential.
Because if we don't value ourselves...
It's hard to value anything else.
Yeah, and it's hard to, like, show up for other people in a healthy way.
Totally. So I think a real-life example here could be, like, someone who's always helping their friends, with their problems, but then their own life is, like, a mess.
Oh, yeah. Their finances are in shambles. They haven't slept in days, but they're giving everyone else amazing advice.
Right. And it's like you can't pour from an empty cup,
Exactly. So take care of yourself, folks. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity.
Okay. Moving on to rule 3. Make friends with people who want the best for you.
This one is so, so important, I think.
Huge. Yeah. Because, like, who we surround ourselves with, it really matters.
It shapes us, right?
It does. And in the book, he talks about these 2 friends of his, Chris and Ed.
And they had, like, totally different trajectories.
Right. Both smart guys, but, like, their lives went in such different directions.
And their friend groups seem to play a big role.
Absolutely. And he talks about, like, the dangers of, cynicism.
Oh, yeah, that kind of, like, world weariness.
Especially when you're young, right? Like, you haven't even really lived yet.
But you're already jaded.
Jaded, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's saying, like, that's dangerous.
Because it becomes self-fulfilling, right? Like, if you believe the world sucks...
then you're going to act in ways that make it suck.
And you're going to attract people who also believe that.
Exactly. So it's like this negative feedback loop.
Pulling everyone down.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, this might resonate. Like, think about high school.
Oh, God.
Or even college. Like, sometimes there's this pressure to, be cool.
But cool often means, like, not trying too hard.
Right. Or, like, not caring.
Which is so messed up when you think about it.
Totally. And he contrasts that with, like, finding people who are actually supporting.
Who want you to succeed.
Yeah. And he talks about his own experience in college.
Yeah.
Finding this group of, like, nerds, basically.
Pure just like excited about learning.
And about life, and it totally changed his trajectory.
So for everyone listening, think about your friends right now.
Like the people you spend the most time with?
Do they lift you up? Do they encourage you?
Or do they, kind of drag you down?
Even subtly.
Right, because it can be subtle.
Yeah.
And it's not always like intentional,
Yeah, sometimes people just don't realize the impact they're having.
But it's real.
Okay, and then he also talks about like this danger of trying to rescue people.
Oh, yeah, like the white knight syndrome.
Yeah, and it can be well-intentioned, right?
Of course, but it can also be like really damaging.
With people.
Yeah, because sometimes people just don't want to be rescued.
Then you can't force them.
You can't. And he brings up Dostoevsky here, Notes from Underground, which is like all about that.
Like this resistance to being saved.
And it's deep, man. It's like sometimes people are attached to their suffering.
Yeah, it's messed up, but it's true.
And so his point is like, you got to choose your friends wisely.
People who are already on a good path.
Yeah, people who are like striving for something positive.
It's so much easier to be pulled along by that momentum.
Them to try to drag someone uphill.
Totally. And it takes like humility to recognize that.
To be like, okay, I can't fix everyone.
And it takes courage to like walk away from relationships that aren't serving you.
Even if they're old, even if there's history.
Yeah, that can be really hard.
But sometimes it's necessary.
So real life example, think about two people, right?
Okay.
One has friends who are all about like healthy living, exercise, good food.
And the other person's friends are all about like partying, staying up late, eating junk food.
Like, who do you think's going to be healthier?
Right. It's not rocket science, but it's easy to forget.
Totally. Your friends, they really do rub off on you.
Okay, on to rule 4. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today.
Oh, this one hits hard in the age of social media.
Doesn't it? Because you're constantly bombarded with everyone else's
highlight reel.
Highlight reel. Exactly. And it's so easy to like fall into that trap of comparing.
And feeling inadequate.
Totally. And the book, it acknowledges that. Like, this is a real problem.
That social comparison can be really damaging.
Especially now with, everything so interconnected and hierarchical.
Yeah, it's like everyone's striving to be at the top of something.
And there's always someone, richer, more successful, whatever.
So what are we supposed to do? Like, just ignore it?
Well, he's not saying ignore it. He's saying, like, shift your focus.
From external comparison to internal comparison?
Exactly. So instead of comparing yourself to, some influencer on Instagram.
Who's, like, living their best life, supposedly.
You compare yourself to, like, who you were yesterday.
Or last week or last year.
And you focus on your own progress.
Your own growth.
Yeah, like, what have you improved on? What have you learned?
And he says that's actually a much healthier way to, like, manage that inner critic.
That voice that's always telling you you're not good enough.
Because, like, if that voice is always negative,
no matter who you're comparing yourself to,
then maybe it's not a very reliable source of information.
Right. It's just like a broken record.
So, take it with a grain of salt.
And instead, focus on your own journey.
And celebrate your own wins, no matter how small.
Yeah, because those small wins, they add up.
And he talks about, like, the future, right?
Yeah, and this idea that, like, your actions today, they do matter.
Even if it doesn't feel like it.
Because they're shaping the future.
Your future, and maybe even the world's future.
And it's so easy to, like, fall into that nihilistic thinking, like, what's the point?
Yeah, in a million years, who's going to care?
But he's like, no, that's a cop-out.
We got to take responsibility for our choices.
And believe that we can make things better.
Okay, and then he talks about resentment, which is an interesting one.
It is, because he's saying, like, resentment can actually be useful.
As a signal.
As a signal, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, if you're resentful of someone else's success,
it might be telling you something.
It might be saying, like, hey, you have this unmet need.
Or, like, you're not taking responsibility for your own life.
Right. But he also says, like, sometimes resentment is valid.
Like, if it's a response to actual injustice.
In which case, you should speak up.
Yeah, don't just sit there and stew in it.
So it's about, like, discerning. Right?
What kind of resentment is this?
Is it just me being petty? Or is there something bigger going on here?
And then he gives this advice, which I love. It's like, pick one small thing you can improve today.
And just focus on that.
Just one thing.
And he even says, like, talk to yourself nicely about it.
Like, have a negotiation with your inner critic.
Be like, hey, I know I haven't been great at this.
But I'm trying to get better.
Can you help me out here?
It's so funny, but I think it actually works.
It does, because it's like you're not beating yourself up.
You're being compassionate.
And then he also talks about like the price of progress.
That sometimes you got to let go of old things.
Old beliefs, old habits.
Even parts of your identity.
Yeah, the things that aren't serving you anymore.
And he contrasts, like, the Old Testament God, this kind of, like, demanding, punishing figure.
With this idea of aiming higher.
For the betterment of being.
Yeah, like striving for something good, something true.
And he says, like, the central ethic of the West is really about that, like, focusing on the present moment.
But also striving for something greater.
And he brings up the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, which is all about, like, doing the right thing, even when it's hard.
And it's not about, like, being perfect.
It's about constantly trying to improve.
One small step at a time.
And measuring your progress against your own past self.
Not against some, impossible standard.
So, real life example here. Think about someone who's trying to get in shape.
Okay.
If they're constantly comparing themselves to, like, Olympic athletes.
They're going to get discouraged.
But they're tracking their own progress, like how much weight they're lifting, how far they're running.
That's much more motivating.
It's about the journey, not the destination.
All right. Rule 5. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Oh, parenting advice. Here we go.
The big one. But this is actually more about socialization than, like, specific rules.
It is, yeah. And he tells this funny story about, like, trying to feed his kid.
And the kid's just, like, refusing to eat.
And he's, like, pulling his hair out.
But it's relatable, right? Like, every parent's been there.
Totally. And he talks about, like, discipline.
The dreaded D word.
But he frames it in a really interesting way. Like, he talks about minimum necessary force.
What does that even mean?
Well, he brings up English common law, which is like the idea that rules and punishments
shouldn't be more than necessary.
Exactly. Like, you don't need a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
So with kids, it's like start with the smallest intervention that works.
And only escalate if you need to.
So like timeouts instead of, grounding for a month.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes positive reinforcement, like rewarding good behavior.
Pitch them being good.
Yeah, because that's actually much more effective than like constantly punishing.
It's like you're training a dog, basically.
Kinda, yeah. But he also acknowledges that like negative emotions are important.
You can't just be all rainbows and sunshine.
Right. Like kids need to understand that there are boundaries.
And that actions have consequences.
And for no to be effective, it has to have some teeth.
Like there has to be a threat of something bad happening.
Otherwise, they're just going to ignore you.
And then he talks about permissive parenting.
Which he's not a fan of.
He thinks it's setting kids up for failure.
And he uses the example of Sleeping Beauty.
Oh, yeah, the Disney movie.
Where the parents try to, like, shield her from all evil.
Which just makes her totally unprepared for when it actually shows up.
Exactly. So he's saying, like, we have to let kids experience challenges.
In a safe way, of course.
But we can't just bubble wrap them.
And then he talks about parental resentment, which is something I think a lot of parents can relate to.
Oh, yeah, because it's inevitable, right?
Like, kids are going to push your buttons.
They're going to misbehave.
Yeah.
They're going to test you.
And it's so easy to get resentful.
And that's when, like, the parenting goes off the rails.
Yeah, you start yelling, you get inconsistent.
So he's saying, like, we have to be aware of that resentment.
And manage it.
Yeah. Find healthy ways to deal with it.
Because ultimately, our job as parents is to prepare our kids for the world.
To socialize them.
To make them, like, functional members of society.
And that means, like, teaching them how to interact with others.
How to be polite, how to respect boundaries.
Yeah, and he says, like, that's actually more important than, trying to impose a specific identity on them.
Like, let them figure out who they are, but give them the tools to navigate the world.
So real life example, think about a kid who's learning to share.
It's a classic parenting struggle.
And it's not easy, right?
Yeah, but you've got to be consistent.
Set clear expectations, have consequences when they don't share.
And eventually they get it.
And that sets them up for, like, healthy relationships later on.
Okay, rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world.
Oof, this one's a tough one.
It's a call-out, isn't it?
It is. And he's not pulling any punches here.
He's saying, like, look, before you go on about all the problems in the world,
take a look at your own life.
Is your house in order?
And he brings up some really, dark stuff like mass shootings, suicide rates.
And he's suggesting that, like, part of the problem is this lack of meaning.
This lack of order in people's individual lives.
So it's like, before we start blaming, capitalism or the
Like
government.
whatever the scapegoat of the day is.
We got to take responsibility for ourselves
For our own choices, our own actions.
and start making small changes.
In our own lives.
And he's not saying, like, ignore the problems of the world.
But he is saying, like, you got to start with yourself.
Because if you can't even manage your own life.
How can you expect to change the world?
And he says, like, when you start to bring order to your own life,
It actually makes you a better judge of the world.
you're less prone to, like, bitterness and resentment.
You're more clear-headed.
And you can actually start to see things more objectively.
And he brings up Ecclesiastes, which is like this ancient book of wisdom.
That talks about, like, the brevity of life.
And the inherent suffering.
And he's saying, like, look, life is hard enough as it is.
Don't make it harder by adding your own chaos to it.
So, real life example here. Think about someone who's always complaining about society.
But their own life is a mess.
Their apartment's a disaster. They're always late. They're in debt.
It's like, okay, maybe start with cleaning your room.
Before you try to fix the world.
Okay, now for a big one. Rule 7. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient.
This one is, like, the heart of the book, I think.
It is. It really gets at, like, what it means to live a good life.
And he starts by talking about sacrifice.
Which is a heavy topic.
But he connects it to, like, our awareness of the future.
Like humans, we're the only creatures who really understand that we're going to die.
And that knowledge, it changes everything.
It does. It makes us think about, like, what's important.
What's worth living for?
And he brings up Adam in the Bible, like that moment when he realizes his own vulnerability.
And he's like, oh, crap, I'm going to die someday.
And that's when he starts to understand, like, work and sacrifice.
Like, I have to do things now to ensure my survival later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he contrasts that with animals who just kind of live in the moment.
They're not thinking about the future.
They're just reacting to their instincts.
So he's saying, like, work is a uniquely human thing.
It's about making choices, planning ahead.
And sacrifice is part of that.
It's about giving up something now for something better later.
And he says, like, the bigger the sacrifice,
the bigger the potential reward.
And then he gets into this really interesting idea, which is that, like, morality is born out of sacrifice.
Whoa. How does that work?
Well, he's saying, like, once we start understanding delayed gratification.
And the idea of exchange, like giving something to get something.
That's when we start developing, like, a sense of fairness.
And then you add in this idea of a judging higher power.
Which doesn't have to be God, necessarily.
It could be, like the community or even just your own conscience.
But it's this idea that, like, someone's watching.
And judging your actions.
And that's when we start to develop, like, a code of conduct.
Like what's acceptable behavior.
What's right and wrong.
And then he brings up Socrates.
Who chose to die rather than run away.
And he's like, that's the ultimate example of choosing meaning over expediency.
Like, Socrates knew he was going to die anyway.
But he chose to die on his own terms.
For his principles.
And that's powerful, man.
It is. And then he talks about this, like, inherent tragedy of being human.
That we're aware of our own mortality.
And we know that suffering is inevitable.
And so it's so tempting to just seek out pleasure.
To take the easy way out.
To choose expediency.
But he's saying, like, that's a trap.
Because true meaning comes from, like, facing the hard stuff.
From doing the work.
From making sacrifices.
And then he brings up Cain and Abel.
Which is all about, like, resentment and jealousy.
Like, Cain kills Abel because he's jealous of his sacrifice.
And I think his point is, like, we all feel that sometimes.
That sense of, like, why am I putting in all this effort and not getting what I deserve?
And it can be so bitter.
It can turn you into a Cain, you know?
Yeah, it can make you do terrible things.
And then he talks about Christ's temptation in the desert.
Which is like the ultimate test of willpower.
Like Satan's offering him all these things.
Power, wealth, whatever he wants.
But Christ resists.
Because he knows that there's something more important.
A higher purpose.
And so he's saying, like, we all have those temptations.
Those moments where we can choose the easy path.
Or the meaningful path.
And it's not always clear which one is which.
But we have to, like, look deep inside ourselves.
And ask, what's truly worth striving for?
And then he tells this story about his landlord who was struggling with addiction.
And it's such a good example of this, like tension between expediency and meaning.
Because in the moment, you know, taking a drink, it seems like the easy solution.
It makes the pain go away.
But in the long run, it just makes things worse.
And so this guy, he had to choose, like, am I going to keep going down this path?
Or am I going to choose something harder, but ultimately better?
And it's not easy, but that's